Good afternoon. Hey, what's going on out there? Robert Phoenix, broadcasting to you live once again from Austin, Texas. The 9th of February, 2018. Sorry for the delay today. I was, sometimes I just get real busy. And I had to work with some clients. And sometimes these things just take precedence. Got to finish one thing, get to another thing, and thank God I don't work for a multinational corporation, because at least I can do this and have some flexibility. We can all be happy. And it was really great experience working with two young people in their 20s, early 20s, married, 2 kids, and they have a dream. And their dream is to move to Hawaii and grow food and live a lifestyle that's not traditional, off the grid. Raising their kids, homeschooling them, being a part of a larger group of people that are invested in doing the same thing in their own way. These two are just totally rock solid. Totally rock solid. And, it's like, I know the millennials catch a lot of heat. And sometimes it's warranted. And there are other times when it's like, this is what it's about. 2 people having a dream, together, young couple, grounded, saying, we're going to do this. We're committed to it. And I worked with them for a couple of sessions and kind of got very clear on certain parts of their charts and where the strengths were, where they could grow together, where they needed to grow together, and all that kind of stuff. And it turned out really great. And wish them nothing but the best. And do it for yourselves and do it for humanity. Because we need good stories. And there are good stories out there. We don't often hear about them. There are people living lives that we don't know about. Lives that are filled with dignity and character. And they're adding versus subtracting and taking away from the big picture. And we need more of that. It's essential. It is an essential piece of our evolution. So, what's going on? Interesting times, as always. The budget passed, or will pass, and it's obscene and bloated. And I think Trump and the Republicans and the Democrats should be absolutely and utterly ashamed of themselves. There is so much pork in that budget. If you're a Republican, I don't know how you can sign off on that thing. I don't get it. I mean, these people are, we're not into big government. We're not into big government. Well, look at that budget. That government just metastasized. And I love Rand. Rand Paul. The Pauls are an interesting family. And nobody is perfect, and nobody is perfect in politics. But he takes the right stands at the right time. And he was basically saying, look, we don't really need this. This is not fiscally responsible. And the great thing that he said was that if Trump wants to have a parade, bring the soldiers home. How about that? What a novel thought. That's not going to happen anytime soon. Afghanistan is the new Saudi Arabia for minerals and those rare earth minerals and the precious metals. And of course the opium. And people who can control Afghanistan are going to control a lot of the marketplace. And this is what people don't understand about war. So we're at war to keep those resources now. Because if we leave, then guess what? Then the Russians come in or the Chinese come in and they begin to dominate the global marketplace and all that stuff. And I mean, it's nasty. Life on Earth is nasty. It is not an idyllic situation. And certainly as we go through Saturn and Capricorn, we realize that, not that these people are grown-ups, but they're running the planet in a way that has very little conscience. Maybe that's because it's been cremated, the cremation of care. But there's an exigency, I believe is the word, when it comes to locking down the resources for the global domain. And there's competition for those resources. And there's a place certainly for idealism. Because what happens, or heart, or compassion, or empathy, because when we lose touch with those things, then it just becomes one orgiastic, fascistic party of control. And it doesn't matter what side it's on, left or right. They'll both indulge in it. Anyway, that's in the air. And we're staring that down. There's some interesting things also happening on the horizon. They want to nationalize the 5G network. Boy, that should be fun. They want to nationalize it. Should I read you the story? This is from technologyreview.com. The Trump administration says it wants to nationalize the 5G network. President Donald Trump's national security team is considering how best to build a national 5G network. Who says we need one? A senior administration official confirmed the initiative and provided Axios with a PowerPoint outlining some of the proposal. The motivation, the primary reason cited, is to stay competitive and guard U.S. networks against China. So competition is going to be one of these, and the competition is real, by the way, but it's also going to be used anytime they need to as an excuse to further either an agenda or add an existing technology, which also coheres and conforms to some kind of control and command. Okay? The document argues that a strong 5G network is the gateway to advancement in technologies like self-driving cars and virtual reality. Who the hell says we need self-driving cars and virtual reality? Just because it's in a movie that happened 15 or 20 years or 30 or 40 years ago, who says we need it? We've got enough issues to deal with so-called reality. We don't really need virtual reality all that much. And the self-driving car, good luck. Good luck. Do you think people in their 50s or 60s are going to want self-driving cars? Do you think baby boomers who have had access to the planet, hop, skipping, and jumping all over the planet since the 1960s, international, national, they were raised on Jack Kerouac, on the road. Right? Do you think they want self-driving cars? I don't think so. So what's going to happen is you're going to have to eliminate a large group of people because their habits are ingrained. And they don't want people telling them, well, gee, your car could shut down at any moment if we wanted to. And it could happen. Let's say all of a sudden you're driving along in your car, your self-driving car. You're watching the world go by. I don't know, maybe you're checking your horoscope. And all of a sudden you're late on a payment with something. And all of a sudden your car goes, brrr, pulls you off to the side of the road. You get a little flashy thing. Meep, 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 meep. And you look, and you're late on a payment. They do with your cable TV. You're late on a payment with your cable TV. What do? They shut it down. You got to go turn it back on. Like, okay, I've been late on this payment. Let me pay it. You paid it, and all of a sudden, boom, ding, ding, ding. You're off on the road again. You think people want that? You think they want that? They don't want that. But there are certainly people that want the ease of a self-driving car. Think of all the other things you could do with a self-driving car. You could answer emails. You could have meetings. You could be so productive with a self-driving car. With a self-driving car, you would have to focus on the road. If you had your family in the car, you could talk. You could play games. It'll bring you closer together. That's if you have a family. And gee, think of all the perverted things you can do in a self-driving car. Talk about autoeroticism. Hello? So, do we really need it, though? I don't think so. But they think you do. And they think you're going to need virtual reality. In order to make it happen, we're going to have those 5G networks. So here we go. The network, the report outlines 2 possible paths to 5G. The network built and funded by the U.S. government. 2, a system built up by networks constructed by mobile carriers. FCC Chairman Ajit Pai has already expressed his opposition to the idea of a government-run network. Well, how about that? See how long he does that. Companies like AT&T and T-Mobile, meanwhile, have been investing heavily in the area for some time. Heck, even Facebook has gotten in on the action. But Axios reports that the White House is leaning toward option 1. That would be a massive departure for an administration that has billed itself as keen to reduce the role of government in private industry. This is a Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn moment waiting for us in the event horizon. Not only that, but DHS wants to be able to scan your face even better. So if you're hanging around the borders, facial recognition software is going to be amped up, improved. And that's where it starts. I have no doubt that the facial recognition software will be ubiquitous, and it'll be congruent with retinal scanning and all the goodies that come along with this wonderful technology that we have at our disposal. Funny, I was talking about Elon Musk yesterday and the Mars, the journey to Mars with the Tesla Roadster, and there is a new listener named Brooks who sent a interesting email, and he said that he made this connection. David Bowie played Tesla. We know he played Tesla in The Prestige, and Bowie, of course, wrote the infamous great song Life on Mars, one of my favorite songs of all time. And now the Roadster is headed to Mars. Ergo, the astronaut who is piloting the Tesla Roadster to Mars is Bowie. That's Bowie inside the Tesla. It's an interesting thought. You know what else is interesting? We've had 3 Johns die this week. 3 Johns. John Perry Barlow. John, I forget his last name now. He was the father on Frasier. And then today's John Anthony West, who we're going to talk about. And I'm actually going to replay a show I did with John Anthony West in September of 2013. It was 5 years ago. You know, I remember when I did that interview with John Anthony West, and I looked at his picture and I said to myself, I wonder how long this guy's going to live. He looked old. He looked old. You could tell. When people get old, you can just, the spirit, the essence begins to leave the body slowly. It's like a slow leak in a tire. You can tell. You can just look at their eyes. And I could see that a little bit with John Anthony West. And when I remember doing that interview, my heart got a little heavy because I thought to myself, this man's not going to be around forever. I mean, that was 5 years ago, and he passed away. He's remarkable, absolutely remarkable guy. Changed how we looked at the world and how we dealt with things like accreditation. He was a maverick in the world of archaeology and anthropology. I mean, he was incredible. And he came in with a real outsider's perspective and changed how we looked at history and time. He went against the grain, and he had the nickname of the original Indiana Jones. He wore the pit helmets like Indiana Jones, or at least he had the hats and he had the pit helmet. I think he had both. I think he has both versions. The younger Indiana Jones is Harrison Ford, and of course Sean Connery played his father. So I want to replay the interview that I did with John Anthony West on September 27th, 2013. But before we do, we got a little new piece here that we do now every day called the Time Tunnel. And I've got the Time Tunnel music. I downloaded it. I just have to tweak it a little bit because I don't want to get a copyright strike. Anyway, the Time Tunnel is when we go back and we look at what happened on this day in time. There's my music. So today, February 9th, is marked by a couple of very interesting days. The first interesting date is 1775, which is the Revolutionary War, the American Revolutionary War. And the British Parliament declares Massachusetts in rebellion. There you go. That is a shot across the bow coming from the other direction. In 1861, February 9th, Jefferson Davis is elected the provisional president of the Confederate States of America by the Confederate Convention at Montgomery, Alabama. Here we go. An Aquarian event, cutting against the grain. Jefferson Davis, the only president of the Confederacy. Another interesting day in history was in 1950. So February 9th, 1950, Joseph McCarthy accuses the United States Department of State of being filled with communists. I think it's pretty safe to say that he was on the money. But the most important day, in some ways, in history, or at least recent history, was in 1964. On this day in 1964, the Beatles make their first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, performing before a record-busting audience of 73 million viewers across the USA. I actually saw that when I was a little boy. I was a little boy when I saw that. My parents were watching that show, and I was in the other room playing. They urged me to come in. You've got to see this. It was Bobby back then. Bobby, come in. You've got to see this. I walked in there. I was a little grumpy. I was like, I didn't really like being interrupted in my play. Whatever it was important. And I went in there. There's the Beatles. I'm like, I don't like these dudes. I don't like them. Who are they? What's up with those haircuts? They look silly. Why are these people screaming for them? Can I go back and play? I swear to God, that's where my head was at. But eventually, the music was quite infectious. And, you wind up humming the tunes. He loves you, yeah, 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 all that stuff. It was also the start of the Aquarian Age. February 9th, 1964, the start of the Aquarian Age. Because the Beatles were bringing it to America and the world. It was a declaration. It was the beginning of group consciousness. And the Beatles were a group. Of course, there were other groups before the Beatles, but none of them carried the same kind of cultural and esoteric weight. The four Beatles represented the four bodies of man. Ringo, the physical body, the drummer, and a lousy one at that. Paul, the emotional body, because he sang about love songs. He wrote love songs. At least the original Paul did. I guess they all did. All the Pauls did. But that was the emotional body. Paul was the emotional body. Lennon, mental. He was the mental body. Arch, cynical, funny, witty, dark, challenging, acerbic. And then there's George, the spiritual body. My sweet Lord. So all four of them together created this very powerful spiritual monad, which is why in some ways I think they were influential to the degree that they were, and also launching them on the 9th of February, 1964, the dawning of the age of the Aquarius in the 60s. You can set your calendar by it. All right, that was our little time travel Our time tunnel moment. All right, let's get to the meat of the show, because I really want to play this interview. I remember when I did the interview. I used to do a lot of interviews. I mean, people have been listening to this show or variation of this show know that. And I've been doing these interviews for years. And back between 2010 and around 2014, it was really interview heavy. And we still do them, but it's everybody else. I mean, everybody gets interviewed. I mean, you get sick of seeing the same person over and over and over and over again. It's like, oh, there they are, or there they are, or there they are. Oh, there they are, just making the rounds. Everybody's making the rounds on everybody else's show. So I shut that down a little bit, and the people I interview now are not. I'm not interviewing people to get views. Let's put it that way. When I interview somebody, it's because I like them, and I believe in what they're doing, and I think they're interesting, even if they aren't popular. So that's my criterion now for the interviews. But when I did this one with John Anthony West, I remember feeling that it was a special moment for me, because not only was I able to interview somebody who was a real giant and a real pioneer in alternative research and alternative history, but I felt like we really connected. And that's always a good feeling when you are, I felt like I could get on a plane and go hang out with this guy. And we'd have a really good time. So it's with great sadness that I announced that he's passed away. And, we're short another giant in the world. So let's get on with it. This is me and John Anthony West from September 27th, another time travel moment. 2013, it's about the mystery of history, the Sphinx, and all that goes along with it. I'll be back at the end of the interview.
We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant, and I will even say this: such an impression is a clue that at some past time point a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this an alternative world branched off. Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Free Association Radio. This is Robert Phoenix. It is Friday, the 27th of September. Yay. Yay. I'm way ahead of the curve there, aren't I? For the last few days, for whatever reason, I've been wanting to say this is October. I don't know why. I did it before on a reading. I might have even done it on Wednesday's show. Very strange. Anyway, welcome. It is 12 noon here, just 2 minutes after 12. And today I am supposed to be joined by John Anthony West and also E.A. James Swager. And I hope that
Mr. West will show up. Sometimes you never know. These things can go a little wonky, and I have a. Here we go. He's on. He's okay. So here's what I'm going to do. I have to. I'm gonna play some music because that was John, and I need to deal with this. So let me play a little bit of music and try to get this straightened out. Let me play Last Plane Out. Actually, I'll tell you what, since we're in this Egyptian theme, let's get into my Egyptian thematic song, if I can find it. Let me see if I can find it here. Hold on. It's called Quarantine. See if I can find it. All right, let's just play. Let's play. Maybe this is John. Let's find out. Hold on. Hello. Hi, this is John. Yeah,
yes.
hi. Hey, John. Thank you for calling in. I was just about to respond to your
Robert?
and you're here now. So thank you.
Who am I talking to?
This is Robert, the host of the show.
Oh, Robert. Hi. Listen, I just realized actually that that I didn't have you as a Skype contact, so I just sent you a request to do this on Skype. But we're on radio, so it doesn't really matter, does it?
No, it doesn't. We're here together now, and that's what counts.
Okay.
Thanks for showing up, John. How are you today?
My pleasure. I am fine.
Great.
And you?
Great.
Where am I calling?
So this is Free Association Radio. I'm Robert Phoenix, and I'm talking to you live from Austin, Texas.
Oh, that's Austin, Texas. Okay.
Yep.
Very good.
Are you in New York?
Well, I'm in New York State. Yes, not in the city. I'm upstate, Mid-Hudson Valley.
Okay. Excellent. All right. Well, so what I wanted to do is kind of, this is the first time you and I have talked,
yes.
And I mean, literally, we haven't even spoken before the interview. And I've been digging into you a little bit before the interview, trying to do some research. And
yes.
One of the things that I wanted to get a sense of from you, which I really haven't found out either from your Wikipedia page or maybe some of the other sources of information that I've been tracking and digesting, is I wanted to find out about your early life, John.
Yes.
Just to start off, what were you like as a kid? And how the heck did you get into the history and the mystery of hidden history?
Well, I can do that very quickly, or I can spend a very long time.
We got time. You lay it out.
Am I on now? Are we live?
You are
Pardon?
live.
We are live. Okay. Okay. Briefly, by the time I was 13 years old, basically I was the usual kind of kid who turns out to be a writer, a loner, and an oddball. But by the time I was 13, I actually realized that I'd been born into a lunatic asylum. Nowadays, lots of people know that, but back in 1945, that was unusual. So it was pretty lonely. By the time I was 19, I knew what I wanted to do, which was to be a writer, and my aim was to be the little boy who says the emperor has no clothes. What I knew to be a lunatic asylum, everybody else called progress. And I started out with absolutely no intention of getting into scholarship. I started out as a novelist, playwright, scriptwriter, essayist, and all of that sort of thing. And my chosen medium was almost invariably satire. I started getting published at age 25. I was in New York. So before that, I was involuntarily in the U.S. Army, but had a fantastic time because they sent me to Europe, which is where I wanted to go, and I wanted to go to Europe because that was a place where they named streets after poets. And I had a fantastic job that took up 8 minutes a day and some money saved up from summer jobs. So I bought my one and only Porsche directly from the factory for $2,400 in Stuttgart, and
nice.
Drove all over Germany with my German girlfriend, all over Europe with my German girlfriend. Came back to New York, and that's where I had a couple of different jobs in advertising and publishing. And then when my first short story was published, accepted, which was October 15th, 1957, I was wildly in love with a woman who, thank God, wouldn't have me, and said, the hell with this, I'm going back to Europe. And that's what I did. And I ended up on the magical island of Ibiza. This is 57, even before hippies were invented. I mean, it was an art colony, wonderful island off the coast of Spain, in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Mm-hmm. And there I started really serious writing. Again, satire. Had a novel published. That was in '66. But while in Ibiza, I first got interested, again, a long story, but we only have an hour, so I'll cut it short. I got first interested in astrology, and then through astrology in the work of Gurdjieff, who I trust you're familiar with, yes?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Right, and
yes, absolutely.
With Gurdjieff and his school.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And eventually, after I stayed in Europe, in Ibiza for 9 years, actually, I had lots of things published, and produced too, some plays produced in England, and but nothing that made any money. And finally, Ibiza was getting full of tourists, and I'd had 9 years there, so it was time to leave. And I had a then girlfriend, subsequently became my first wife, who was an extremely talented Welsh actress whose boyfriend in university, or in college actually, in pre-university days, was Richard Burton. They were brought up in the same town. And she had superstar quality, but also superstaritis before she was a superstar. So she bungled her own career, and we eventually split. But anyway, I moved to England, and the idea was she'd act and I'd write, and we'd scratch out a living together. And so that's what we did. But my principal aim for going to England actually was to get into the Gurdjieff work, which I joined in '66 and have been in off and on actually formally ever since. I am now. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, I had a novel published, and the editor was a mathematician turned publisher who was a very nice guy, very opposite me in rationalist materials, very opposite me in temperament. But we used to go out drinking, and in a pub one day, he brought up the subject of astrology, and he said, that's a bunch of codswallop. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, Andrew, it isn't. It's a subject I know quite a bit about, and if I wanted to, I could put together some documentation, some of it indirect, lots of it indirect, some of it direct, that would make a case for astrology. And he said, well, that's really interesting. Would you bring that in? And so I did. I brought in the documentation, and he said, well, I'm not 100% convinced, but that's very interesting. Would you write a book about it? And my standard answer when I get a question like that is, well, I'd write a book about anything if you pay me some money for it. It's not quite true, actually, but it's not far off. And I was, as usual, dead broke. So anyway, I got a contract and started doing the research for it. And in doing the research, somebody told me in my Gurdjieff group to check on a book called Herbach, 2-volume novel called Herbach and Herbach Disciple by a woman named Isha Schwaller de Lubitsch. So that book was in English, had been translated into English, it was originally French, and I started reading about it. It was a horrible novel, but the picture that it portrayed of Egypt corresponded in the most amazing way with the portrait that Gurdjieff described in his extraordinary book, All and Everything, Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson. And at a certain point, I bit the bullet, and the novel, Isha's book, kept on, with footnotes, it was a novel with footnotes, kept on referring to the book Le Temple de l'Homme, The Temple of Man, by R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch, her husband. Eventually, I bit the bullet, went to the London library, and there, sure enough, found a copy of the book, which was, of course, only in French, and my French was rudimentary, to say the least, but I just opened it, and it was quite clear almost from the first page that this was an extraordinary book, that this man had basically reformulated the wisdom, the sacred science of the ancients in a manner of impeccable scholarship, but in a way that made it accessible to the over-rational Western intellect. And I just took time out from my astrology book that I was writing and just went to the library every day. I couldn't find a copy of the book. And with a dictionary by my side, by the time I was done, my reading French was pretty good. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't resist putting a big chapter on Schwaller into the astrology book, even though it didn't belong, but nobody, apart from the Herbach novel, it was hardly a bestseller. Schwaller was inaccessible to a Western, to an English-speaking audience. So I had a big chapter in there, and again, the publisher came to me and said, would you do a book on symbolist Egypt, on Schwaller's work? And I said, you bet, which interested me more than the astrology. And so that was how I got into the scholarship. And Serpent in the Sky took 6 years to write. And in doing that research, apart from providing an in-depth introduction to Schwaller's work, and Schwaller is pretty impenetrable, actually. Now, it's all translated into English now, and translated very well. It's a wonderful translation that the Lawlers did, Bob and Deborah Lawler. But even in any language, he's not an easy read, and I'm a writer by trade, so I do have the ability, let's say, to, once I understand it myself, to put it in a language that is accessible. I mean, the Serpent in the Sky is not exactly the Da Vinci Code, but it's accessible to an interested audience. And in doing that research, I came across one line in an ancillary book of Schwaller's called The King of the Pharaonic Theocracy, now translated as Sacred Science. That one line, and of course the Great Sphinx of Giza shows unmistakable signs of aquatic erosion. And that penny dropped in the slot, and I realized that what Schwaller himself didn't realize, that was the key to the lost civilization, to the Egyptian belief themselves. I mean, not just beliefs. It's part of one of several chronological tablets and papyruses that ancient civilization stretches back much, much further than that. And it was a contention also made by Gurdjieff that civilization, that the doctrine, the esoteric doctrine of what Schwaller calls the return to the source, has been around from time immemorial. And I realized that the water weathering to the Sphinx was, or could be, the key, if you could prove it, because that was science. Otherwise, Gurdjieff's word is Gurdjieff's word. Who knows where he got his information from? But that was his contention, and it's the contention, actually, of lots of, you've studied comparative mythology, comparative religions, you realize that that's a theme that runs through virtually every ancient civilization, even all of the traditional so-called primitive, you shouldn't call them primitive, they're just unintellectualized, the traditional societies all harken back to an earlier time where there was a higher civilization, a hell of a lot higher than what we have now, which isn't civilization at all. It's shiny barbarism. Anyhow, I realized that was the key. That was geology, and if you could prove it, you would put all of history, you would turn all of history upside down completely in a flash. And so I set out to document that. And of course, I'm not a geologist, but I did my homework. I can read, and that was the last chapter. Big long chapter at the end of Serpent in the Sky, developing that theory. But what I didn't have was any geological backup. I tried contacting geologists and got either abused or ignored. And it took another 10 years before I finally found Robert Schoch, my very good friend and now my colleague and very good friend, who at a certain point stuck his tenured neck on the line to come to Egypt with us, and eventually became absolutely convinced, 100% convinced that it was water weathering, that it was much, much older than it was supposed to be. It's supposed to have been built by the pharaoh Khafra around 2500 BC. Again, our time is relatively limited. When we're in Egypt on one of my trips, we spend a couple of hours in front of the Sphinx talking more geology than a lot of people are prepared for, but nevertheless, it's essential in order to prove, in order to show that there's no way around this argument. It's rock solid. Geology is rock solid, but it really is. And all attempts to all attempts by the quackademic community to downplay or dismiss the Sphinx theory are actually easily refutable and have been refuted. We still don't have an actual date on the Sphinx. Schock has come a long way from his early, very tentative and very cautious point of view, and now agrees with me that the Sphinx is certainly dates from around at least 10,000 BC, but very likely, again, all of these things that I'm saying, I can back up but the scholarship is complicated, and we don't have that much time. So everything that I'm saying is not pie in the sky or airy-fairy. It's backed by solid science and by solid scholarship. And so the Sphinx is a hell of a lot older, almost certainly, than 10,000 BC. And this, of course, what this implies, sometimes people say, well, who cares how old the Sphinx is? Well, actually, if it's simply chronology, that doesn't make that much difference. I agree. What's the difference if it's 10,000 years old or 20,000 years old or 100,000 years old? Where it becomes significant are the implications, because not only is the Sphinx arguably the most spectacular sculpture on Earth, the temples that surround it, in front of it and to the side of it, are built of blocks of stone that weigh upwards of 100 tons, slotted into place like pieces in a gigantic jigsaw puzzle. We couldn't today, with the technology at our command, build those temples. Now, this is all eventually, as you know, the Sphinx theory created this huge fuss when we presented our case at the GSA, that's the Geological Society of America's annual meeting in San Diego in '91, and then that led through a series of strange coincidences, if you believe in coincidences, but maybe non-coincidences, to our NBC special hosted by Charlton Heston. All of this is a big, long story, by the way, which I will one of these days, soon maybe, incorporate into a big book just devoted to the Sphinx theory. Anyhow, eventually that Mystery of the Sphinx went out, hosted by Charlton Heston. It was one of the most successful documentaries ever done. Came out in Sweeps Week, NBC. I think estimated 30 million people tuned into it on that first showing, and I estimate probably a couple of 100 million over the course of its television life in the ensuing years. Didn't make any money because we had such a mean-spirited contract, because whoever heard of us when we started out, and then my criminal partner, now deceased, stole $150,000 from the till, so we never actually even made any money out of it. But it did put the theory on the map, and me on the map too, as a matter of fact, in terms of public exposure. And it's been going on ever since. Us collecting more and more evidence, and it won't be long now, because what we've lacked up to now is the smoking gun, the one definitive piece of evidence that negates the notion that, well, it's all hunter-gatherers back then, the kind of period that we're talking about. So how could this magnificent Sphinx and these incredible temples have been built? And we couldn't answer that question. All we could say was the geology is the geology. And you guys, this is a geological argument, actually. This is part of the story when Schock was attacked by an Egyptologist within his own college at Boston University, and really a personal character assassination. It was a really nasty attack, and I was in hot water because when we were doing the presentation back in San Diego in '91, the Boston Globe, a science editor of the Boston Globe, interviewed us. He wasn't at the gig, which was out in San Diego, but by telephone. And Schock was, of course, his usual polite and civil scientific self. But when I got on the phone, I said, "Hey, look, this is." He asked us, why are because the Egyptologists and the archaeologists were incensed. I mean, they were hurling abuse at us. Seen such a thing. So I said, this theory involves the weathering pattern in rocks. And when it comes to weathering pattern in rocks, an Egyptologist and an archaeologist's opinion is no more valid than a proctologist. And they published that. So this was an absolute, furious character assassination aimed at Schock came out. And I said, Schock, you really have to, you got to address this. It was the in-house Boston University journal or whatever you call it. And Schock said, no, just let it go. And it doesn't matter. And I said, no, let me handle it. So I wrote her a letter, and I said, I understand you didn't like my line about the proctologist. I said, well, the proctologist didn't like it either. I said, their job was to cure sick assholes. They didn't like being compared to them. So this she sent viral. This went viral. She sent this to the whole Egyptological, archaeological community everywhere, which is, of course, exactly what I wanted her to do. But it didn't make us any friends. Anyway, so this has been going on for a long time. And recently, and I'm sure you know about this, do you know about the site in Turkey, Göbekli Tepe?
Yes.
You know, right. Well, that's our smoking gun. Because here's this extraordinary new site. I mean, discovered in the middle 90s, but carefully being excavated by an impeccable, credentialed, orthodox archaeologist named nice guy, named Klaus Schmidt. And only 5% of this amazing site has been excavated. It's a hill, and it's been deliberately covered over for reasons that nobody really understands, including us. But what it is, and most of it's still underground, but through ground-penetrating radar and seismographs, they know that this hill features, I think it's 22 or 23, closely adjacent stone circles, like mini Stonehenges, and not so many, with big pillars made of big stone pillars, meticulously finished and carved with an extraordinary array of symbolic animals, birds, geometric figures. And because it was deliberately covered, again, all of this is well documented, so I can't give you the details here. But Schmidt dates Göbekli Tepe because the fill that was used to cover this dates from about 8,000 BC, and the fill. So Schmidt himself dates these stone circles to at least 10,000 BC, and they're working on a new one now that they're excavating. Graham Hancock is over there at the moment, or was there very recently. And Schmidt is dating the one that they're uncovering for reasons I forget. I think just because of the size or something, or maybe the fill. No, the fill's all put on the same time. But anyway, he's now talking about 14,000 BC. So that's our smoking gun, because no tools have been found. Even the archaeologists are not challenging the dating. And we're talking about 12 to 15-ton stone pillars that have been brought from a distance, about a mile away, uphill to erect in these stone circles. Nobody knows what the stone circles were for yet, but we have some pretty good ideas, Chuck and myself and a few of our other colleagues. And nobody's found any tools there yet. So they don't know how these pillars were carved. And these are in high relief, which means that you have to carve the surface of the pillar away so that the carving springs out from the surface. I mean, this is 10 times more difficult than carving into the surface, and nobody's found any tools. So there we are, hunter-gatherers, but pretty smart hunter-gatherers, to build 22, 23 stone circles out of stones that weigh up to 12, 15 tons, and then carve them. So that's our smoking gun. In other words, no longer can they use the argument that geology be damned, it's all hunter-gatherers back then. Maybe it was hunter-gatherers, but they sure knew how to carve stone. And so we're now busy, Schock and myself, putting together a program, putting together a proposal, and looking for the finance to get a follow-up to Mystery of the Sphinx done, but this time as a theatrical release rather than television, which is no longer what it used to be, network TV, no longer what it used to be back in the early 90s when we did our show. Mm-hmm. So in a very long nutshell, that's how I got into it, and that's where we are now.
Well, thank you for that ramp up into present time. It seems to me that the academic mafia is so invested in Darwinian evolutionary theory that they really can't crack their heads open and wrap their heads around alternative models. Why are they so deeply invested in Darwin?
Well, that is a very big question, and actually it's funny that you bring it up because Shock and I have two books that we want to co-write. The first one is the one on the Sphinx theory, and we have most of the material for that. That should be pretty easy to do. And the other one is a definitive anti-Darwin book, which is provisionally titled Darwin Debunked, Darwin Declawed, Darwin Dethroned, a scientist and a scholar deconstruct the cargo cult of the West. Darwinian evolution is a fact. I mean, insofar as there are facts in science, evolution is a fact. Darwinian evolution is completely a superstition, and it's easily demonstrated as such. But they are invested into it for two reasons. One, they're academics, and people don't like changing their minds. So, I mean, nobody likes changing their mind, me included. So here are people, and the same applies to symbolist Egypt. Here are the Egyptologists that have spent all of these 10, 15 years getting their PhDs, and here comes somebody from out of left field like me. Well, Schwaller first, of course, but they haven't read him, but me, I'm out there with my big mouth. And here somebody comes along 30 years later or comes along and says, hey, everything that you've been talking about Egypt is wrong, and you're just going to have to change your minds. Well, they don't want to change them. And I can understand that, but that's not what scholarship and science is supposed to be about. Beyond that, actually, because Darwinian theory presupposes a meaningless universe.
That's right.
Actually, I mean, values are impossible in a materialist within a materialist philosophy in which science, so-called science, is the deciding factor. But Darwinian theory is the linchpin of a materialist, atheist, rationalist philosophy that is, in its own right, in its own way, religious in the sense of dogma, not religious in the sense of the aim, but it is the religion of the emotionally defective, the spiritually dyslexic, and the philosophically depraved, who will defend that, the notion that there is some meaning to our human lives and to, in fact, human life in general, and they will defend it to the death because they lead empty lives. For these people to actually change their minds requires them going through what I call an NLE, which is a near-life experience. Until that point, and the reason that they are immune to this or insusceptible to this is actually my Japanese martial arts teacher some years ago used to say, I'll do his Japanese accent as best I can. You want happy in crazy world. You know talk moonbeam to blind. You know to talk music to deaf. And especially, you know talk sex to eunuch, because them just get angry and sometimes violent. So basically, what we're doing is talking sex to eunuchs, and they don't like it.
Yeah, you hit that right on the nail of the head, and it feels to me, and I've been, having this bang around in my brain for a while, that the people that are so deeply invested in Darwinian evolutionary theory are also really prime cases for psychopathology, because it gives them the license and the credence to do whatever the hell they want, regardless of the consequences to the earth or to other people in general. That's
right. Although sometimes, actually, the religious, these are the materialist fundamentalists. The religious fundamentalists are actually just as bad.
They are.
In terms of doing what they want.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they talk a bunch of religious baloney, but they don't practice what they preach at all. They don't even know what they're preaching, and they're just as bad. But yes, you're absolutely correct that Darwinian basically Darwinian theory sociologically supports the notion of survival of the fittest. They don't use that as an argument anymore, but they still think that way, that they have the right to do anything that they damn please because, in fact, we have no divine responsibility because divinity, the sacred, is simply a polite word for superstition.
Right. And it also creates in them an inbred superiority because they believe that everything else is superstition and folklore. So it elevates them to a status of being their own god or their own creator and a rational part of the universe. Yeah,
exactly so. And Chuck and I are hoping. I mean, we really, and I mean, this is a good combination because I'm the writer satirist, and Chuck is as highly credentialed a scientist as you can get with his triple PhD from Yale in geology, geophysics, and paleontology, and between us we put up a pretty formidable argument, and we're hoping actually that because my sense of it is that if you had to pick one thing that made a real civilization impossible to initiate again, Darwinian evolution is at the bottom of it. It's almost, in a way, I feel like a fundamentalist making an argument like that. It's like Pat Robertson saying that Hurricane Katrina happened because of homosexuals getting married.
Right.
But really, I really do feel that of all of the things preventing a renaissance in the true sense of that word, Darwinian evolution is at the bottom of it.
Yeah, I agree, and I would probably put Freudian psychology a close second as well. So
yeah, I wouldn't anymore. 50 years ago, you could have said that, but nowadays, I mean, Freud is not really the father figure, as it were, that he once was.
Yeah, that's true.
And Freud was a Darwinian, of course.
Yes, he was, absolutely. Did you ever think how ironic it was that you found a partner by the last name of Schoch?
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? It's not spelled the same way, but that's how it is. That's how it's pronounced. Schoch is how it's spelled. But it is funny, yeah, you bet. There are lots of people have used, have commented on that.
Yeah. Whatever happened to Lehner, the Egyptologist that was your staunch opposition during the...
He still is the staunch opposition. We're not making any waves until we get either our book written, the one about the Sphinx theory, which we will eviscerate him, or the video. We were hoping to do both of those things simultaneously, actually. Mm-hmm. And there's lots more involved in our grand plan, actually, with some of it, which brings in Zahi Hawass, who actually I get on with personally. With Lehner, actually, when we meet, we're civil, but we don't much like each other, I guess. And yeah, go on.
So didn't Zahi go to jail for a while?
He was briefly under house arrest, I think, but they tried to nail him with all sorts of things, basically because, he rose to power under the Mubarak regime, and he was actually personally on very good terms with Suzanne Mubarak. But, you can't help it if you're going to be a public figure. I don't think it's not that he was a great Mubarak fan, but especially. But anyway, they tried to nail him, and they didn't. They dropped all the charges, and of course now that the military is back running things, which I knew they would do. I was there for the whole of the revolution back in 2011, and everybody was talking all of this baloney about democracy, as if we had one.
Right.
And I was saying, no, the military is not going to. They don't care who's in power. They're not going to give up their perks and their privileges and all of their power and so on. And this is how it's worked out. And actually, a good thing, because the Brotherhood, which I call the Muslim-Imbecile Brotherhood, was busy sort of trying to turn in.
That's great stuff.
What?
I said you are a satirist. The Muslim.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's great stuff, man. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's what I'm in the process of bringing back republishing a lot of the things I wrote earlier, which all got published, but they're out of print now. But a whole bunch of different little books of stories and parables, and the novel that I wrote in the 60s, and all sorts of stuff will soon be available again, I hope. And anyway, so the Brotherhood was busy trying to turn Egypt into something like a Taliban light, and the people, of course, this is not Afghanistan, and the people were absolutely in the streets. At one point, there were 30 million people in the streets before the military marched in and took over. And can you imagine what America would be like if a third of the population suddenly took to the streets and said, we don't want the NSA and we don't want the NDAA anymore, and we don't want to be surveilled, and we don't want to be groped in the airport, and we want you sons of bitches out of there. There really would be some change.
It would be a great day. It would be a great day in this country.
But they're all busy getting fat in McDonald's and wandering around glazed-eyed in Walmart, so nothing's going to happen until it's too late anyway. But so the military marched in and kicked the Muslim imbeciles out, and now they've illegalized them even. And I'm wondering, my sense of it is, and I make my living really such that it is out of my Egypt trips.
Yeah.
So they're on hold at the moment, but I feel that I'm not so sure about this last move. If this doesn't get the crazies out shooting up what few tourists that are there at the moment, or blowing up a temple or something like that, maybe not. If they understand that the military means business and that they're not going to win this battle, some sort of a grudging truce will be affected. I mean, I think actually that they should allow the Muslim imbeciles their own say, as it were, just as we have, people just as stupid and just as crazy, and they happen to be the governor of Texas or of Illinois, wherever the hell Paul Ryan comes from. So
right.
we have our nutcases too, and they're legal, and I think the Muslim imbeciles should be too. But that's just my opinion. And they would never win another election. They talk about this tiresome drumbeat of blah blah democracy, as if that mattered, or as if we had any. The reason that they won those elections is that they had an organization, and and they weren't part of the revolution. They jumped in at the last minute before any of them had to get shot, and the kids that ran the revolution got shot and killed and beat up by the military. But they had no organization. There were a whole bunch of different factions that didn't agree with each other, and the Muslim imbeciles had an organization, and so they actually did win the election. But so what? Since when has America given a damn about who won an election? Our Secret Service, the CIA, routinely murders anybody, or fiercely opposes anybody who wins an election that we don't like.
That's right.
So,
or
anyway.
here in the home front, the election will be rigged accordingly so that the right candidate or the candidate that's been chosen can step into the residency in the Oval Office.
Exactly. Well, that's exactly what we have here. I mean, when you have an election where the Koch brothers or some of these Monsanto or some of these other barbarian organizations or individuals throw millions and millions of dollars into the campaigns, and their candidate miraculously wins, and that's democracy. Although they don't always win, and in fact, in Egypt, the Muslim imbeciles only snuck in by the tiniest of margins. So they'd never, even if they're made. If they're re-legalized by the military, and I think they should be. Mm-hmm. They're not calling me up asking me for advice, so it's just talking through my hat. But if they were re-legalized, they'd never win another election, and they'd be, as I said, like a whole bunch of Southern Baptists making noise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think they're pretty marginalized at this point, and
they are.
Yeah, and I think there's way too much momentum, and I think the military is too strong to allow them to have any kind of real foothold in the future of their governance there.
Exactly.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Atlantis, John.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sorry. I know you wanted to talk about that, and I've been blabbering on all the time.
This is all great stuff, fascinating, and getting to know you and your backstory is absolutely fascinating. But I wanted to get your take on. Well, first of all, they found some ruins now off the coast of the Azores. That's just in the news recently, and they're thinking that perhaps this might be an outcropping of Atlantis. But I wanted to get your take on that, but also the connection between what you might feel would be Atlantis and the Sphinx.
Yeah, actually, it's easy enough, and because everybody, there's a whole Atlantology out there, and in fact, somebody you might want to contact, a good friend of mine, who's written you might call it the Complete Atlantis. Do you know who Jocelyn Godwin is?
I've heard the name.
A musicologist and terrific writer, teaches professor at Colgate. He's written a book called Atlantis and the Cycles of Time. And this is the one, it isn't even that long, this is the one really good Atlantis book. You read this book, you don't have to read anything else about it. And basically, he's in agreement with Schock and myself, which is that, and we'll bring in somebody here that you almost certainly have never heard of, and it's partly my fault that you haven't, that the story, the lost civilization, the Sphinx itself, the water weathering to the Sphinx is proof that a lost. You don't need any more than that. If that were the only thing you had, like was Alfred North Whitehead says, all you need is one white crow to prove that all crows aren't black. That in and of itself proves that in deep, deep, deep antiquity there was a highly sophisticated civilization capable of supreme artistic mastery and the technological expertise that we can't reproduce today. Well, that's already enough to throw the whole thing upside down. But was there an Atlantis in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean or anywhere else? If you follow this stuff, there are a dozen different accounts of Atlantis. It's at the North Pole, it's in Antarctica, it's in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, it's in Spain, believe it or not, it's in the Altiplano of Bolivia and Peru. Everybody finds reasons to think that Atlantis is here, Atlantis is there. And what they're doing is they're all using the description in the Timaeus and the Critias of Plato in their search for Atlantis. But if you read that, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It's the circles and the moats and the walls and so on. This has been examined in tremendous detail by an extraordinary scholar that not an awful lot of people have heard of. I think he's still alive. If he is, he's about 10 years older than me, which makes him in his 90s. Named Ernest G. McLain, McClain, who is a musicologist and a Sufi. And he, in a book called the Pythagorean Plato, and it's a book written around the time, I think the reason that I don't mention it in The Serpent is that it was published around the time that I was publishing My Serpent in the Sky, so I couldn't fit it in there. And for whatever reason, when new editions, and I added appendices to the Serpent, I forgot about it or didn't, because anyway, what McLain does is building upon the work of other scholars in the 19th century who contended that Plato's myth is not to be taken at face value, but rather that it is an allegory of some sort, specifically a musical allegory. And McLain is a musicologist, and he proves in the most uncertain terms that this is exactly what Atlantis is. It is using music theory to address the Plato's students, all of whom were musically indoctrinated, as it were, and through the laws of harmony, showing how harmony descends or degenerates into disharmony, because all of those numbers, the motes and the number of warriors and the number of distances and things like that, all have numerical values. If you stop to think about it, you say, well, how does Plato know all of this stuff? Solon, supposedly, his grandfather, came back from Egypt, and he got all of this from a priest, and he told Plato all about these numbers, and there were this many walls, and this many, it was this high, and that was that big, and so forth and so on. All of a sudden you say, hey, wait a minute, how does he know all of that? When it's decoded as a musical allegory, the whole thing makes perfect sense. And I'm not a musicologist, so I can't do a check on the figures, but I have friends who are musically sophisticated, and they say, yeah, well, all of this checks out perfectly. So what we're left with now, on the other hand, there's our Sphinx. Now, in the beginning, I heard through mutual friends who knew McLean that he had maybe that's why I didn't chase him up, that he had absolutely no use for our Sphinx theory or anything like that, and he didn't believe that there was any historical veracity to the Atlantis myth at all. Mm-hmm. But then subsequently, and I have an email from him that I somehow, I think, buried and never answered, where he agreed, because what I felt when I came across that book, or when I studied it, was that there was no way that McLean could be wrong. On the other hand, there was no way in which our Sphinx theory could be wrong either. So what looks like a diametrically opposed theories really isn't, because what I think it is that Plato got the story from Solon, which was a story basically of a lost civilization that disappeared in, if not one fell swoop, but anyway, a lost civilization in deep, deep, deep antiquity. And to the bare bones of that story, Plato invented his musical allegory to teach the dangers of harmony descending into disharmony. And suddenly the two are complementary rather than in opposition to each other. And that's my take on it, and Shock the same. We're absolutely certain there is this lost civilization, but we doubt very much that it is. We think it's global, because the evidence of it pops up all over the place. I don't know, another guy you might want to interview is very interesting also. A friend of mine lives nearby here, is Laird Scranton. Do you know his work?
I just discovered it, and you were talking with him on YouTube about string theory, the Dogon in Egypt.
Right.
Yeah.
Because Laird's work, I think, is very important in that it shows that this sophisticated cosmology existed worldwide, because all of the cosmologies, wherever you go, China, there's a whole new book coming out on Chinese cosmology, which corresponds with the Dogon, which corresponds with the Egyptians, which corresponds, it's all over the place. So we think there was a global civilization, again, sort of you might say, a verification of the biblical thing, what is the Tower of Babel, that before that, all humanity spoke one language. That one language might not have been, English or Chinese or Turkish, but rather the language of cosmology. They knew.
Yeah, interesting stuff.
So that's our take on it. No, that it's a big mistake to go looking for Atlantis here, there, or whatever, but the lost civilization is pretty well demonstrated.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to have Michael Tellinger back on in a couple of weeks, and he makes a very strong case for very similar civilizations existing in South Africa. And
maybe, but Tellinger, unfortunately, is a Zecharia Sitchin fan, and actually that's a kind of galactic Darwinism, which I have absolutely no use for.
That's interesting, John. I'd like to just explore that really briefly while we have a few minutes left. There are people, and I'm I've been agnostic when it's come to Sitchin. I've never totally bought into the Sitchin mythology, and I've seen that there are people that have produced pieces of evidence that Sitchin faked a lot of the stuff that he found. Is that something that you've discovered as well?
Yep. And more to the point, actually, the only part of Sitchin that I felt that had potentially any validity was his translations of the ancient Assyrian texts. And since none of the Assyriologists would take him seriously enough to disprove him, which is not Sitchin's fault, I always had to leave it as a moot point that those texts were translated correctly. But not too long ago, there was a biblical scholar with no axe to grind. You can tell very easily. Anyway, I can tell when I have no axe to grind, who is an Assyriologist and who picks apart Sitchin's translations and shows that they're completely fraudulent and off the wall. And I don't have the name in my head. I think his name is something Fisher, but I'm not sure what. But I'm sure if you Google up Sitchin, and a sort of repudiation or something like that, you'll find this guy. It's only last year or so that he published what he did, and I can send you. I have it somewhere in my list. I can send you the link if you want to see it.
Yeah, I'd actually like that. So do you think that?
Because I find Sitchin in fact dangerous, and I find what I back putting on my satirical hat again. I call his followers Sitchin-innies.
Sitchin. Snitching on Sitchin. So do you think that because Tellinger follows Sitchin, that it invalidates his findings in South Africa?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. No. He could be quite right about. But actually, I know the one thing that he does of this kind of spirally thing of stones that he has some sort of an interpretation to, and somebody else, and I forget who it was, interpreted rather, which I thought much more accurately. Maybe it's very old, but it's a manner of a sort of a corral in which to trap wild animals.
Interesting.
Makes perfect sense. So you drive them in there and they can't get out, and then you have food for the year. Anyway, but the Sitchin stuff I have absolutely no use for, none. And this linguistic annihilation of his translations, to me, invalidates them completely. Before, I always left open the possibility that the translations were in fact true, and then you had to account for them.
Right.
And
so
how are we doing? We've got a couple of minutes more.
We've got a few minutes left here. John, you're into your ninth decade on this planet. You're 80.
Yep.
81, is that right?
81, yeah.
81. Now, I had a brief look at your birth date. You're a Capricorn. You're born January.
No, Cancer.
You're
July 9th.
Your Wikipedia is wrong.
Well, I didn't write it. I don't know who wrote it.
So when is your birthday?
July 9th, 32.
July 9th, 32.
Somebody else told me that the other. I don't know who wrote the thing on Wikipedia.
Yeah, somebody's got you pegged as a Capricorn. So.
Oh yeah, but I don't know. I have never even read that. I'll have to look myself up.
Okay. So, anyway, I just wanted to clarify that. And your buddies with Gerald Salente too, right?
Yes, I was working with him, colleague. I was working with him actually for the last 4 or 5 years, but we've now gone separate ways. I was co-writing the Trends Journal with him, and this is, we don't agree on everything, but the Trends Journal he's taken the journal in a different direction, and it was taking up much more of my time than I wanted to devote to that. But I'm very proud of the journal that we produced over those years.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, if people want to find out, let's say somebody's listening to the show and they loved The Mystery of the Sphinx, which, by the way, you can find on Netflix. It's available on Netflix.
Right, yep.
And Netflix Digital as well. John,
yep.
Let's say I want to get behind John and Robert Schock to do the next volume of this. Where would they go to find out more about you, your work, and some opportunities that could be available for people that want to jump on board with you?
Well, my website, really, and then just get in touch with me and email me and tell me. I mean, the trips, I had one scheduled. I don't even have it up on the website because I was waiting to see what was happening with all the military and stuff going on in Egypt. But I'm sure the one scheduled for November isn't going to work. But there will be another one, assuming that the military will calm things down. And I mean, I'd go right now. They're not after us. This is the main thing. They're busy shooting up each other, but the tourists are fine, the few tourists who are there these days. So I wouldn't even hesitate to go right now. But the next open trip will be in March.
In March.
But anybody can email me. I'm easy enough to find. Or if it's serious, call me, but I prefer email.
So jws.net is your website, right?
Yes.
JWS. Okay. And people can find you there.
Sure.
John, you're a national treasure. And
thank you, Robert.
And
well, I'd say an antiquity. Hell.
Hey, let's get you back on the show again sometime if you're into it.
Sure.
Okay?
But meanwhile, look up Jocelyn, who's a Brit and extremely well spoken and literate, and he would make a very good somebody for your show, and also Laird Scranton. Who again really knows his stuff. And these are people with important, who are making important contributions.
Yep, I've duly noted, and I'll get Dee, my producer, to get in there and see if we can make some connections and set up some times to be on the show. So yeah, we'll definitely do that. Well, thanks again, John.
Yeah, and again, just a parting word, anybody who's interested, the trips, I didn't even mention this actually, but after 2 weeks on seeing Egypt through symbolist eyes, you understand something that you cannot understand at all without being there. You cannot understand what it feels like to be in a real civilization where people understood what they were here on this planet for, and had the means of realizing that aim. It really is an eye opener.
Well, maybe I'll come out.
It's not cheap, but it's also, for what it is, it's not expensive either.
Right, and it's it could be a once in a lifetime experience where you get to hang out with you and get real hands-on,
that's right,
powerful, direct explanations and experiential moments.
Oh yeah, it's really. I mean, my folder. I have a folder of people saying exactly that this really is a life-changing experience. And in fact, people usually come thinking it's once in a lifetime, but they come back for 3 and 4 and 5 trips even, because it's self-replenishing. It's an amazing experience. I think it's one of the reasons why at 81 I'm as fit as I am, despite the vodka.
Well, I was told that if you're going to drink anything, drink vodka, so you probably made a good choice.
Oh, yeah, well, definitely, yes, and a reasonably good vodka, too.
Good, excellent. Well, John, maybe I'll see you out there one of these days in Egypt.
Thank you, Robert. I hope you do, and you know how to get hold of me.
Okay, you take care now.
You too. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
That was the amazing John Anthony West. How about that? Amazing John Anthony West.
Wow. Sadly, he's gone. He's left the planet, and whatever mysteries he's been in the dark with, hopefully he's getting some answers. Not that he was, I think, desperately looking for them. John was a guy who enjoyed the journey, and you could hear it in his voice. And he'll be missed. This was a significant being. Just listen to that interview, and it's not the only one out there, obviously, but he knew stuff. He knew stuff about Egypt and beyond, and he knew stuff about the current political climate. He understood power and dynamics and nations and internecine politics. That was a pretty well-rounded dude. And he's gone. So it's a sad day for this world in terms of alternative research and all the sundry industries, cottage industries that go along with it. Then we had John Perry Barlow die. And then again, there's a guy from, I always forget his last name, the father from Fraser. Another John, 3 Johns. John, I'm Only Dancing. Barlow, a very different character than John Anthony West. I used to kind of be in Barlow's circle a little bit. I mean, I was Neptune in Barlow's circle. I lived in the Bay Area, and I was part of a magazine called Mondo 2000 in the final days of Mondo. And JPB, as he was known back in the day, was probably on the Mount Rushmore of cyberculture because of his relationship with the Well and the Electronic Frontier Foundation. The Well became kind of a model for the internet, and it was a bunch of geeks and nerds who had a BBS service back in California. And there was people like Barlow and Stuart Brand and a lot of those characters. And out of that came the EFF. And so Barlow was associated with Mondo, and we used to do a number of stories on him. I think it was at least in 3 issues of Mondo. And then the final issue, I think it was in the final issue, if I'm not mistaken. But he would show up at parties. I'd be at a lot of parties at Barlow, and John always carried himself with this kind of regal air. Excuse me. He was a Libra. He always had this. He always had this regal air about him, and he always had good-looking women around him too. Barlow was a bit of a player, and I didn't really get to know him all that much, but I was kind of around him, and I would see him and have a few words, whatever. It wasn't like I was like buddy with him, but it was, he was in the same space a lot. And I remember getting on Facebook early, and Barlow was kind of one of the early adopters of Facebook and using Twitter to send his tweets to Facebook. So when he would tweet, it would go to his Facebook feed. And I remember getting into it with Barlow. I was going through this period where I was deconstructing everybody and everything, and and he was described as a libertarian. Like he liked to have this. He had this idea or this image of being this kind of libertarian cowboy. He owned property in Wyoming, and of course he was a songwriter for the Grateful Dead, and he was. I guess Barlow was kind of a Jeffersonian like modern figure. Now, my good friend Eddie Lynn, who I want to have on the show one day, he got into some deconstruction around Barlow as being a CIA operative. I don't have any problem with that, by the way. I think that that's possibly quite true, because I often wondered, besides the Grateful Dead songs, how did this guy make money? How did John Perry Barlow make money? And he'd go to Davos, and he was a jet setter. He was all over the place. He had to be on somebody's payroll. I ultimately disagreed wholeheartedly with his politics. I found him becoming far too left-leaning for my taste. And I don't mind a little left. We need a little left every now and then. A little left, a little right, a little dark, a little light. Put it all together. But I couldn't. I couldn't deal with his politics. However, ironically, I was actually paid to write kind of a liner note for a remix of. He did a state of the declaration for the internet. It was like the Declaration of Independence for the internet. It's actually pretty good. And a friend of mine put it to music, and so they asked me to write the liner notes for it. Essentially, I should probably dredge that up somewhere. It's pretty good writing. Barlow loved it, apparently. Said I totally got it. Totally got what was going on. Anyway, so we have the three Johns who passed away this week, and of course John Anthony West and the John. I keep forgetting his name. I could just look it up, and I won't. Interesting guy. He was apparently he played Fraser's father. But he was probably, I think, right around the same age as Kelsey Grammer, which I thought was funny. But they say things come in threes. There we go. All right. Well, listen. I hope you really enjoyed the interview with John Anthony West. They just don't make people like that anymore. They just don't. Muslim imbeciles. Stitch and Ninnies. Come on, how could you not love that? How could you not love that? Stephen Cremmy, if you're listening, you should figure out how you can reprint some of those books that he has somehow, somewhere, sometime. All right, let's shut it down for today. I want to thank you all for listening and hanging out, re-listening to that interview with John Anthony West. And they'll be back on Sunday night at 8 o'clock. How about that? 8 o'clock. Central Standard Time for the YouTube live stream, the Astrological 11th House live stream. And looking forward to that so that we can all get to bed early on Sunday night. And you don't have to stay up late and get up all blurry-eyed on Monday. So 8 o'clock on Sunday night, we're regathering for the live stream. Okay. You know the drill. Use your head to discern what's real, your heart to stay open what's possible. I'm Robert Phoenix, and I'll see you all on Sunday night. Have a fantastic weekend, and